Welcome. My name is Edward Lahiff, and I'm presenting today on behalf of colleagues from University College Cork and the University of the Social Sciences and Humanities in Hanoi, Vietnam. Our paper is entitled Khau for the 21st Century, the Reform of the Household Registration System in Vietnam. Rural urban migrants in Vietnam are socially and economically marginalized in terms of employment, housing, and access to education, health, insurance, and social welfare services. Despite high demand for labor and high wage differentials between rural and urban areas, public policy has in the past been to limit permanent migration to the cities and ensure that migrants are tied to their rural homes in multiple ways. Reform of the law of residency in 2020 promised to replace the old paper-based permit system, widely known as Khau, with a more flexible IT-based system with promised benefits for migrants and for public administration. This research aims to critically evaluate recent reforms against the background of wider public policy and the lived experience of migrants in the Vietnamese capital, Hanoi. And this is based on fieldwork carried out in a joint project between 2019 and 2022 by University College Cork and the University of the Social Sciences and Humanities. Migration is a massive issue worldwide. Most scholarly attention is tended to focus on international migration, which is great in extent. But even greater is internal migration, migration that happens within countries, particularly the populous Asian countries of China, India, and Vietnam. Although this tends to receive rather less scholarly attention. Migration is driven largely by structural transformation of societies and economies as part of globalization and industrialization, but also can be affected by factors such as conflict, climate change, and poverty. The main global trend is rural to urban migration of largely poorly educated and less skilled workers, both male and female, and some families. National policies, such as in the areas of urbanization, industrialization, and population control, also shape and constrain patterns of migration. Migrants constitute a distinct and often a disadvantaged and exploited community within destination cities. In Vietnam, the system of Khau was introduced between 1957 and 1964 in what was then North Vietnam, with strict controls on population movement. The program of renewal known as Doi Moi from 1986, together with other reforms such as Land Law of 1993, relaxed regulations and facilitated greater movement of population between parts of the country. Since then, official policy has shifted towards a more flexible and accommodating approach to ensure a supply of labor to growing urban and industrial centers, and in the face of pressure from civil society and international organizations. Policy rigidities, however, coupled with economic necessity, have created a world of circular migration, with migrant workers living a precarious life in the city and supporting families back in the rural areas. Migrants themselves are demographically diverse, but tend to be young, single, and roughly balanced between men and women. Younger migrants are as educated as their urban peers. Residency policy has intersected with employment practices to create a two-tier system of employment, with permanent urban residents dominating formal employment. That means with contracts, various benefits, and opportunities, while migrants are concentrated in informal employment, that is casual or self-employment, low paid, few social benefits or protection, and few opportunities. According to the World Bank, at least 5 million Vietnamese in 2016 had only temporary registration in their place of residence, plus an unknown number without any status. Up to recently, the system of household registration was seen as a major constraint on migrants in terms of choice of jobs, wages and conditions, access to social services, and access to housing. But it was evidently not a significant obstacle to migration itself. In practice, constraints on temporary migration have been relaxed or even ignored over the years. Further change has long been on the agenda, with a major report from the World Bank and the Vietnam Academy of Social Sciences in 2016 calling for comprehensive reform and highlighting the positive impacts on public and individual finances, and on public administration, and the wider public support for reform. The 2020 law on residency gives effect to the 2013 Constitution's provisions regarding citizens' rights to free residence in the country. The law replaces the manual method of residence management by household registration books with electronic residence management with the application of information technology. Management of citizens' residence information will be implemented digitally through the National Database of Population, Residence, and Personal Identification Numbers. Each citizen will now have only one permanent residence and no more than one temporary residence permit at a time. Under the 2020 law, a place of permanent residence is defined as a place of stable and long-term residence of a citizen that is registered as their permanent residence. In contrast, a place of temporary residence refers to a place of short-term residence. In addition, a person can live in an area for less than 30 days with a temporary stay status, for example, tourists, business travelers, or other visitors. Cities such as Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City previously imposed additional conditions on applicants, such as a 3-year waiting period. The new law abolishes such local variations and applies a single legal framework throughout the country for those applying for permanent residency. A migrant can now apply for permanent residence in any city or province as long as they can show evidence of a lawful place of residence that meets certain criteria. Looking now at temporary residence provisions, the fear of losing privileges in rural areas, especially access to agricultural land, and administrative barriers meant that most migrants previously registered as temporary residents in their destination city or province. Under the paper-based system, some migrants could, in fact, hold multiple permits, while others might hold none, leading to much administrative inefficiency. The new law stipulates that migrants applying for temporary residence can submit a document showing a lawful residence, such as a lease contract, without any requirement for a minimum housing area, as applies to permanent residence. The digital process should be simpler and more secure for applicants, thereby encouraging compliance. The elimination of multiple overlapping permits and lengthy paper-based processes should also lead to gains in administrative efficiency. The 2020 law created a new online residence management system or database, accessible and updatable by agencies anywhere in the country. Information is to be entered into the population management database and is connected to specialized databases controlled by other regulatory agencies. The law on citizen identification of 2014 stipulated when a citizen presents their citizen identification card at the request of a competent agency, organization, or individual, they must not require the citizen to present additional papers for certifying the information already available in the database systems. Each citizen from 14 years of age is granted a citizen identification card containing a personal identification number, which can be used to conduct a wide range of official transactions. This means that Vietnam now possesses a unified information system for each individual and a fully integrated population administrative management system, including a national public service portal and a national population database system, key elements of the national policy on e-government, also known as digital government. Looking now at the likely impacts of recent legislation on areas such as livelihoods. The current policy looks set to facilitate migration and ease the burden on migrants, but will probably not change the fundamental and mutually reinforcing problems of precarious residency status and informal employment. Certain matters remain tied to residency status, such as access to agricultural land, which remains important as a component of migrant family livelihoods. Other reforms currently underway are proposed in education, social insurance, healthcare, housing, and employment, will ultimately be as important as reforms to residency policy itself. All are moving more or less in step, and from the point of view of migrants, in the right direction, although there is still a long way to go. The poor condition of migrant housing itself has been driven by scarcity and desire among migrants to save money on accommodation. Relatively high numbers of single migrants or couples unaccompanied by children facilitates high densities of occupation under rudimentary conditions. The socioeconomic factors shaping housing conditions and access among migrants are unlikely to change as a result of recent reforms. Access to social housing for poor and disadvantaged groups remains based on pre-existing or permanent residency, as well as household income, and is unlikely to contribute much to migrant housing in the short to medium term. Provision of housing for migrants will continue to fall mainly to private landlords and, in some industrial areas, to corporations. The housing requirement for permanent residency is perhaps the most challenging aspect of recent reforms. A minimum living area is required of 8 square meters per person, or 32 square meters for a family of 4, which amounts to an insurmountable barrier for most migrants. Applicants, however, are not required to own the property. They can apply with the agreement of the owner where the property is rented, borrowed, or shared. Better off migrants who can afford such properties are likely to find their application for permanent residency easier than before. On the other hand, some better off families that acquire second homes in the cities may not be interested in permanent residency, such as families with family members attending university. While this policy might make sense from a public health or housing perspective, current reforms will do little to alleviate the housing problems of migrants, and the minimum area requirement will ensure that most migrants remain with temporary status. Looking now at education of migrants' children, we can say that many social and economic factors deter migrants from bringing school-aged children to cities such as Hanoi. By law, state schools must give priority to permanent local residents and only accommodate others when places are available. Many migrants, therefore, take recourse to private schools and kindergartens, which may not be easily accessible or of suitable quality and are relatively expensive. In the suburban areas and industrial zones, however, school places are often more plentiful and migrants do not face the same barriers as they face in the city centre areas. Quotas for school admissions are increasingly now based on local assessment of demand and supply of school places, which may create more opportunities for migrants over time. Addressing the school needs of migrants will, however, require a fundamental shift in the provision of public school places in areas with high densities of migrant workers based on actual needs. Access to healthcare for migrants has long been tied to place of permanent residence. In the past, migrants have had to return home to avail of services or pay extra for access to clinics or pharmacies in the city. Recent reforms in public health insurance and wider health policy means that migrants now enjoy greater access to a range of healthcare services in the urban areas, heavily subsidized by the state. As with education, this has been achieved through reforms of sectoral policy rather than of residency policy itself. Access to social insurance has up to recently been influenced more by employment status than by residency status. There's a strong association between migrancy and informal employment, which means that migrants remain at a major disadvantage when it comes to accessing social insurance and the benefits associated with it. Up to recently, compulsory social insurance, which was widely applied for formally employed workers, entitled them to 5 benefits. But voluntary or self-funded insurance was limited to 2 benefits and was unattractive to most low-paid workers. Gradual reform of social insurance is likely to see the expansion of access and benefits for informal workers, but this process has been slow. Under COVID-19, the requirements to return to a home place to make the monthly contributions for voluntary insurance has been abolished in favor of electronic payments, a major benefit for migrants who have insurance. In terms now of our overall assessment of recent reforms, we can say that for over 50 years, Khau has facilitated a system of circulatory rural-urban migration in Vietnam. Together with a 2-tier employment structure, that is both formal and informal, This has put millions of migrant workers in a second-class category of urban residents who may remain temporary for their entire working lives and are significantly disadvantaged in terms of employment opportunities and social benefits. A critical analysis of current reforms of residency policy reveals that while Khau may be the most prominent symbol of this system, it is far from being the only problem, and a range of other policies and laws affecting citizens' rights and benefits also need to be reformed. The good news is that many such reforms are now underway at varying paces, driven by pressure from citizens, from political structures, from international organizations, from civil society organizations, and from business. While the issue of permanent residency remains a challenge, it is gradually becoming less significant as migrants have more options available to them. And this is a process that appears set to continue. The reform or modernization of residency policy gives an important signal to state and society more generally that the needs of migrant workers and their families are indeed important. And furthermore, that public policy must facilitate rather than hinder the ongoing transformation towards a predominantly urbanized and industrialized middle-income economy and society. A single national identity number and electronic access to a growing range of services will undoubtedly make life easier for migrants, assuming they can master the technology. For the state itself, these reforms, if properly managed and resourced, promise huge gains in terms of efficiency and effectiveness in planning and delivery of infrastructure and public services. Finally, with regard to policy recommendations, we can conclude that ongoing research is required to ascertain the needs of migrant workers and their families and how barriers to social and economic inclusion can be overcome. E-government has the potential to reduce many of the time-consuming and expensive administrative chores faced by migrants. More equitable access to healthcare, education, and social benefits, such as pensions and paid maternity cover, can be achieved as part of wider policy reforms, as recent experience shows. Financial and administrative barriers around housing look likely to continue to be the single greatest constraint on permanent rural-urban migration in Vietnam for some time to come. And in addition, formal employment remains key to securing a range of benefits and improving the livelihoods of migrants. Current efforts to reduce the scale of informality should therefore be greatly expanded. I'll leave you with a list of references cited in the presentation and in the forthcoming paper that underpins it. And really, to finalize, I just want to thank you for your attention and acknowledge the role of our institutions in Hanoi and in Ireland, and particularly support of through funding from Irish Aid and the Irish Research Council. And please do visit our website, Social Inclusion in Hanoi, at the address below. Thank you very much.